On the 6th of November, 1914, the guns opened up before dawn. The warships of the British Indian Expeditionary Force sat anchored in the gray mouth of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, their steel hulls streaked with rust and salt, their barrels pointed at a crumbling Ottoman fort on the mudflats of Fao. The order to fire had come from thousands of miles away, from a mahogany desk in the Admiralty Building in Whitehall, London, from a man who would go on to become the most celebrated leader in British history, Winston Spencer Churchill. But here is what no official communique, no parliamentary debate, no history textbook printed in a British school would ever plainly say. The soldiers who waded ashore through the black mud of Mesopotamia that morning were not there to protect empire's honor. They were not there to defend an ally, avenge an insult, or punish an aggressor. They were there to steal something. Something ancient, something vast, something that lay beneath the desert floor of a land the world would one day call Iraq. And before this story is over, you will understand that what Churchill engineered in the sands of Mesopotamia in 1914 was not a military campaign at all. It was a corporate raid, a heist carried out by the most powerful empire on earth, planned in secret, executed through deception, and built on a foundation of strategic calculations so cold, so deliberate, and so ruthless that its consequences have never, not for a single day, stopped unfolding. To understand why British warships were aimed at a crumbling fort in a remote Ottoman backwater, you have to understand the man who put them there. And you have to understand a decision he made 2 years before the first shot was fired. A decision made not on a battlefield, but in an office. Not by soldiers, but by strategists who understood that the wars of the future would be won not by the bravest army, but by the nation that controlled the most critical resource on earth. In 1911, Winston Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He was 36 years old, constitutionally incapable of thinking small, and possessed of the kind of relentless, restless ambition that made him simultaneously the most useful and the most dangerous man in government. He arrived at the Admiralty with a single obsession: speed, power, the future. The Royal Navy was the iron shield of the British Empire. It controlled the world's sea lanes. It was the reason a small island nation in the North Atlantic could project military force to every corner of the globe. And Churchill believed, with total and absolute conviction, that it was running on outdated technology. Coal-fired battleships produced enormous clouds of black smoke visible on the horizon for miles, advertising their position to every enemy vessel within range. They required teams of stokers, men working in hellish temperatures deep in the ship's belly, shoveling coal into furnaces. And during battle, those men were pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. Coal-burning ships had limited range. They were, in Churchill's estimation, relics. For 100 years, coal had powered the greatest navy the world had ever seen. Britain had built its naval supremacy on a very specific geological advantage. The Black Valleys of South Wales produced the finest steam coal on Earth. It was cheap, it was abundant, and most critically of all, it was entirely exclusively British. As long as the world's navies ran on coal, Britain held the ultimate strategic card. It owned the fuel. No other nation could threaten British maritime dominance, because no other nation could replicate British coal in the volume or quality required to sustain a modern battle fleet. This was the bedrock on which the empire rested. The reason the ships kept sailing, the reason the trade routes stayed open, the reason half the globe remained painted in imperial pink. The Royal Navy maintained coaling stations at every strategic choke point on the planet. At Gibraltar, at Malta, at Aden, at Singapore, at Cape Town, at Hong Kong. Each station was a stockpile of Welsh anthracite, a physical anchor of British power in that ocean, that sea lane, that corner of the world. If you could reach a British coaling station, you could refuel and fight. If you couldn't reach one, and everything that Britain had built over 3 centuries of maritime supremacy would begin, slowly and then very quickly, to collapse. This was the world Churchill inherited when he took command of the Admiralty. A world of coal and of absolute British control over coal. Brilliantly, and with a full understanding of the risk he was accepting. But in 1912, Churchill made the decision that would change the course of the 20th century. He ordered the Royal Navy to switch from coal to oil. The engineering logic was devastating in its clarity. Oil burned hotter than coal, delivering significantly more speed to large steel warships. It burned cleaner, leaving no telltale black cloud on the horizon to betray a fleet's position. Ships could be refueled at sea, extending their operational range almost indefinitely. An oil-powered fleet was faster, deadlier, harder to detect, and vastly easier to operate under combat conditions. To make his point concrete and irrefutable, Churchill ordered the construction of the Queen Elizabeth class of super dreadnoughts, 5 battleships of unprecedented speed and firepower, to be run exclusively on oil. They would outrun, outmaneuver, and outfight anything the German Kaiser could put in the water. From a purely military standpoint, it was nothing short of genius. From a strategic standpoint, it was the most terrifying gamble the British Empire had ever taken, because Britain had coal. Britain did not have oil. Not a single significant oil field existed beneath British soil. And in that one devastating fact lay a vulnerability so enormous, so fundamental, so existential, that it kept the most powerful men in the empire awake at night. Churchill had not merely upgraded the Navy. He had taken the single most important military asset the British Empire possessed and made it entirely dependent on a resource that Britain could not produce for itself. He had placed the survival of the empire in someone else's hands, and he knew it precisely. In July 1913, he stood before Parliament and said what no one wanted to say aloud. He told the assembled members that Britain must become the owner, or, at the very least, the controller at the source of the oil it required. It was not a policy proposal. It was a confession of strategic terror, dressed in the language of forward planning. And it pointed, with the precision of a compass needle, to one specific place on the map. In 1908, a British prospector named William Knox D'Arcy struck oil in southwestern Persia. It was the largest oil discovery the world had ever seen. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed the following year to extract and refine it. By 1913, a pipeline ran from the Persian fields south across barren mountains and desert to a refinery on Abadan Island, sitting at the exact point where the Shatt al-Arab waterway meets the Persian Gulf. The oil flowed south. The profits flowed north to London. And Churchill watched the whole arrangement with the focused intensity of a man who has found a partial solution to his worst nightmare, but knows it is not yet secure enough. In June 1914, barely 6 weeks before the First World War began, the British government did something it would spend the next several decades carefully downplaying. It purchased a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, 51%. The Parliamentary Act authorizing the purchase received royal assent on the 22nd of July, 1914. 11 days later, the Great War began. The British government had become the hidden controlling power behind a private oil corporation, binding national strategic interests to commercial ones, in a way no democratic government had ever publicly done before. Churchill secured a 20-year fuel supply contract for the Navy. The government injected capital for expansion. It was not framed as a nationalization. It was framed as a necessary wartime measure. That framing was not accidental. It was deliberately constructed, because the real plan, the larger plan, could not be discussed openly in Parliament or printed in the press. The real plan was Mesopotamia. Controlling Persian oil was only half the solution to Churchill's problem. The territory immediately to the west of Persia, the land drained by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of the world's first civilizations, the land of Babylon and Nineveh, was widely understood in British intelligence circles to sit above one of the most extraordinary untapped oil deposits on the planet. British geologists had noted the same deep rock formations extending from Persia westward into Mesopotamia. The surface of the land was already leaking, evidence of what lay below. Bitumen seeped through the soil near ancient ruins, exactly as the historian Herodotus had recorded centuries before Christ. The oil was almost certainly there. Everyone in British strategic planning was near certain of it. There was only one problem. Mesopotamia belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans had already been talking to Germany. Germany had been systematically courting the Ottoman Empire for years, understanding with cold-blooded clarity that whoever controlled the Middle East controlled the energy supply of the coming industrial century. The German strategy was comprehensive, patient, and deeply alarming to London. Kaiser Wilhelm II had made 3 personal visits to the Ottoman territories. German military officers were embedded at the highest levels of the Ottoman army, restructuring it, training it, modernizing it into an instrument of German strategic interest. The Kaiser had personally delivered a speech in Damascus, declaring himself the protector of all Muslims on earth, a calculated piece of geopolitical theater designed to inflame the loyalties of the hundreds of millions of Muslim subjects who lived under British rule. In India alone, Britain governed 300 million people, a significant proportion of whom were Muslim. Every German move in the Ottoman Middle East was also a move against the psychological foundations of the British Empire. Their most ambitious strategic project was the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, a steel artery designed to link Central Europe to the heart of the oil-bearing territories of Mesopotamia, bypassing the sea lanes that Britain controlled. In 1912, a consortium called the Turkish Petroleum Company was formed with British and German participation, specifically to hold prospecting rights over Mesopotamian oil. In March 1914, just 4 months before the war began, a reorganization meeting was held at the Foreign Office in London. British and German diplomats, bankers, and oil executives sat around the same table and read through the shareholding arrangements. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company took a 50% stake. It appeared to be a business meeting. It was also a race. Everyone present understood that the nation which controlled this company when the guns started firing would own the oil when the guns stopped. Churchill was meanwhile running a parallel operation entirely separate from the official diplomatic channel. In 1913, he dispatched a naval expedition to the Persian Gulf under Admiral Slade, specifically to investigate the oil possibilities of the region and assess the military requirements for protecting them. And in a secret agreement that appeared in no public record, the Sheikh of Kuwait, nominally a subject of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, was quietly promised British military protection in exchange for exclusive oil rights. Kuwait was declared a British protectorate in November 1914. The sheiks of the Gulf had been moved into position before the game officially began. Then, in late October 1914, the opportunity Churchill had spent years building toward finally arrived. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany. The backroom deals were locked. The secret agreements were activated. The legal justifications for military action had materialized, handed to Churchill by the outbreak of war itself. And the thing that could not be accomplished through diplomacy could now be accomplished through gunpowder and the controlled violence of a professional army. The official justification for invading Mesopotamia was clean and defensible on its surface. Britain needed to protect the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's pipeline and refinery at Abadan from potential Ottoman sabotage or seizure. The story was not entirely untrue. The refinery was real, The pipeline was real, and they did require physical protection. What the official statement carefully omitted was this: protecting a pipeline does not require invading an entire country. And protecting a refinery at the mouth of a waterway does not require a 300-mile military advance into the interior of an empire with which war has only just been declared. The military secretary to the India office, Sir Edmund Barrow, came closest to the internal truth when he wrote in a private communication that the landing was, in his precise words, ostensibly to protect the oil installation, but in reality, to notify the Turks that we mean business, ostensibly. In reality, ostensibly, in reality. The gap between those two words is the gap between the official history and the actual history of the invasion of Mesopotamia. On the 6th of November, 1914, the naval bombardment of the Ottoman fort at Fao began before dawn. 2 days later, British and Indian troops of the 6th Pune Division waded ashore through knee-deep black mud under a sky the color of lead. The mud of the Shatt al-Arab estuary is unlike ordinary earth. It is thick, cold, glutinous, ankle-deep, and it clings to everything. Men carried their rifles above their heads as they pushed through it toward the riverbank. The fort fell within days. The Ottomans at Fao were outgunned and undermanned, and they knew it. They retreated north into the interior. The advance up the waterway began. This is where the protective mission narrative started to collapse under its own internal logic. Because a force sent to guard a pipeline does not pursue the enemy 300 miles into his own territory. A force securing a refinery does not require the capture of the second largest city in the Ottoman province. But on the 22nd of November, 1914, barely 2 weeks after the first, soldiers had waded ashore at Fao. British and Indian troops marched into Basra. They raised the Union Jack above the customs house. They announced humanitarian intentions, and they began fortifying their position for a campaign that had never been formally authorized by Parliament, had never been publicly debated, and had no defined endpoint beyond an objective that could not be stated aloud: continue north until the oil-bearing territories are secured. Churchill was not troubled by the absence of a formal mandate. He was, by every account, electrified. The pipeline was safe. The refinery was operating. The Persian oil was flowing to the Navy, but his eyes, and the eyes of every strategic planner in the British government, were already moving north, across the flat, shimmering immensity of the Mesopotamian desert, toward Baghdad. And beyond Baghdad, toward the northern province of Mosul, which sat directly above the oil fields that British geologists had been describing in classified reports for years. The defensive mission had become a conquest within a fortnight, and nobody in authority had stopped it, because nobody in authority wanted to. Through the first half of 1915, the British advance north through Mesopotamia was intoxicating in its apparent ease. Victories came in a rhythm that seemed to confirm a simple and dangerously incomplete idea: that the Ottoman army was a hollow adversary, that the empire it served was one good push from collapse, and that the road to Baghdad was essentially open. In April 1915, an Ottoman attempt to retake Basra at the Battle of Sheba was crushed decisively. Had Britain lost that engagement, it would have been driven entirely from the Persian Gulf. Instead, it won decisively, and the victory fed a growing conviction in field commanders and politicians alike that this campaign was going to be easier than anyone had dared hope. The regional commander, General Sir John Nixon, was a man constitutionally unsuited to caution. He pressed for more. In June, the city of Amara on the Tigris fell. In July, Nasiriyah fell, alongside the Ottomans' largest supply depot in southern Mesopotamia. Entire Ottoman formations were being shattered and scattered. Their soldiers were dissolving into the desert. Their commanders were retreating upriver toward Baghdad with a speed that looked, from the British perspective, reassuringly like panic. By September 1915, Major General Charles Townshend led his 6th Poona Division into the town of Kut al-Amara. They had advanced 240 miles from Basra. They were 40 miles from Baghdad. The air in British headquarters crackled with the most dangerous emotion in military planning, certainty. Nixon sent dispatches to London that radiated confidence bordering on recklessness. He told London that Baghdad was within reach and that the political and propaganda value of capturing one of the great cities of Islam was incalculable. What he did not tell London, or chose not to emphasize, was that his frontline division was exhausted. The men had been fighting and marching in extreme heat since landing nearly a year earlier. Disease had thinned the ranks: cholera, dysentery, heat exhaustion. The hospitals were inadequate, the supply barges too few, the ammunition reserves dangerously low. A medical officer with the division later testified that the conditions for the wounded were so appalling that men were being carried on river barges without shelter, without proper dressings, without sufficient medical staff, dying in the open under the Mesopotamian sun. None of this appeared in Nixon's dispatches to London. The dispatches spoke of victories, of progress, of an enemy on the verge of breaking. Townshend, a more careful soldier who understood his supply lines with uncomfortable precision, knew that 600 kilometers of Tigris River, vulnerable to seasonal flooding, Ottoman ambush, and the logistical impossibilities of desert warfare, separated his frontline troops from their base at Basra. He had formally requested reinforcements. He had asked for proper hospital ships to handle inevitable casualties. He had requested the transport and ammunition reserves that any sane military planner would demand before extending an already overextended campaign. He received promises. He received a direct order to proceed. And in London, the politicians had found a new vocabulary for the campaign: not oil. Prestige. Baghdad was one of the 4 great cities of Islam. Its capture would project British power across the Muslim world. It would reassure restless subjects in India, Egypt, and Persia. It would demonstrate that the empire, battered at Gallipoli, was still winning somewhere. Underneath all of that noble language, left entirely unspoken in every cabinet meeting and parliamentary debate, sat the actual reason every man at the Pazzi table understood but none would say. The oil fields near Mosul were less than 300 miles to the north. Every mile Townshend advanced was a mile closer to the prize. Ctesiphon sits on the western bank of the Tigris River, 25 miles south of Baghdad, in flat, featureless desert that offers no cover, no shade, and no mercy. The ruins of an ancient Parthian capital stand there, a great vaulted arch of brick, 16 centuries old, the only feature breaking the dead horizontal of the landscape. The Ottoman commander, Lieutenant General Nureddin Pasha, had spent 55 days turning the terrain around those ruins into a killing ground, while wet autumn weather slowed the British approach. 2 lines of deep camouflaged trenches crossed the river's loop. Behind them stood 18,000 soldiers, many of them veterans, fully supplied from Baghdad, with short communication lines and fresh reserves that could be moved into position. Within hours, the British force consisted of 11,000 men at the extreme end of a supply chain 600 kilometers long. And Townshend attacked. He attacked at dawn on the 22nd of November, 1915. What followed was 2 days of ferocious, close-range combat in temperatures that dropped below freezing at night and climbed to punishing heat by afternoon. The 6th Division clawed their way into the Ottoman frontline trenches. They could not break the second line. Their artillery was inadequate. Their flanking movements were frustrated by the river and by Ottoman reserves that arrived from Baghdad fresh and fully equipped. When Nureddin committed his reinforcements, the mathematics of the battlefield became brutally simple. By the time Townshend counted his losses, 40% of his force was dead or wounded. 4,600 men in 48 hours. He ordered the retreat south. The Ottomans pursued. Nureddin, realizing what the British withdrawal meant, cancelled his own planned retirement and followed the broken British force down the Tigris. By the 3rd of December, Townshend's exhausted and decimated division had been driven all the way back to Kut al-Amara, the very town they had captured in triumph 10 weeks earlier. On the 7th of December, 1915, the trap closed. 10,000 British and Indian soldiers, along with 3,500 civilian followers, were completely encircled. The longest siege in British Army history had begun. What happened inside Kut over the next 147 days stripped the invasion of every remaining pretense. Townshend had supplies for roughly 2.5 months. 3 separate British relief forces were assembled and sent north up the Tigris toward the garrison. The first was destroyed. The second was destroyed. The third was destroyed. The total cost of those failed relief attempts was 30,000 British and Indian soldiers killed or wounded. 30,000 casualties to rescue 10,000 trapped men. The arithmetic of disaster compounded with every passing week. Inside the besieged town, surviving soldiers slaughtered and ate their horses and transport mules. Indian troops, given formal dispensation by religious authorities back home, consumed foods their faith forbade. Sickness moved through the cramped streets and mud-walled fortifications with the same unstoppable logic as hunger. Men who had survived the fighting at Ctesiphon began to die of starvation and dysentery inside the walls of Kut, in a final act of desperation that would have seemed unthinkable to anyone raised on the mythology of imperial power. A secret negotiating team was dispatched to the Ottoman commanders. Among its members was a young intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence, later known to history as Lawrence of Arabia, and a diplomat named Aubrey Herbert. They carried an offer of extraordinary humiliation: £2 million sterling. In cash, equivalent to nearly £200 million today, for the safe return of Townshend's soldiers. It was a private transaction between empires, designed to be secret, designed to preserve whatever remains of dignity could be salvaged from the wreckage. Enver Pasha, the Ottoman war minister, appeared to negotiate in apparent good faith. Then, he published the offer to the world. He released every detail to the press and rejected it publicly and ceremonially. The final, perfect humiliation of the greatest empire on earth. The British had come to steal Mesopotamia and had been reduced to arriving at the Ottoman tent with a briefcase full of cash, begging for their soldiers back. On the 29th of April, 1916, General Townshend surrendered. 13,000 men marched into Ottoman captivity. It was the worst British military defeat since the loss of Yorktown in 1781, which had ended British control of America. A commemorative banknote was printed in Istanbul to celebrate the victory. The Ottomans had achieved something remarkable, not merely a military triumph, but an exposure. They had forced the world to watch the most powerful empire in history stumble in the desert it had tried to steal. Nearly a third of the British and Indian prisoners who marched out of Kut did not survive captivity. They died of disease, brutal treatment, and deliberate starvation. Their sacrifice, at this remove, demands a question that no British government has ever answered cleanly. What did they die for? Any government operating on ordinary human psychology would have reconsidered. The catastrophe at Kut was not merely a military defeat. It was a collapse so total, arriving so shortly after the disaster at Gallipoli, that it threatened to permanently damage British credibility across the Muslim world. Senior figures privately warned that the combined humiliations of Gallipoli and Kut could trigger revolts among Muslim populations throughout the empire. The strategic logic for continuing the Mesopotamia campaign had, by any conventional calculation, collapsed. The British government did not reconsider. It rebuilt. Faster, harder, and with a cold single-mindedness that reveals, more eloquently than any diplomatic document, exactly how much was at stake underneath the official language of prestige and duty. The army in Mesopotamia was dismantled and reconstructed. From scratch, incompetent commanders were removed and replaced. New supply infrastructure was engineered across the desert, light railways built on flat ground, additional river gunboats deployed on the Tigris, medical facilities expanded to something approaching adequacy. A force that had begun as a single division sent to protect a pipeline became an operation that would ultimately commit 440,000 men to the Mesopotamian theater. 440,000. For a campaign whose official purpose had been the protection of one refinery at the mouth of one waterway. While the army rebuilt, the politicians were busy behind closed doors. In May 1916, 2 diplomats sat down with a map of the Ottoman Middle East and drew lines that would define the borders of nations and the fates of tens of millions of people for a century to come. Sir Mark Sykes for Britain, François-Georges Picot for France. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the entire Arab world between the 2 European empires. Before either had finished conquering it, Britain took Mesopotamia and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. The agreement was made entirely in secret. It was announced to nobody. Filed away in a drawer. The Arab peoples whose ancient land was being divided among European powers were not consulted. They were not relevant to the transaction. They were territory. They were a governance problem. They were not parties to a negotiation between empires that had decided, in the language of the document, to act as the guardians of civilization in lands they had no intention of ever fully relinquishing. In December 1916, the rebuilt British force, now under the command of General Frederick Maud, began the second advance toward Baghdad. It moved with a discipline and logistical rigor that made the first campaign look like an improvisation. On the 11th of March, 1917, British troops entered Baghdad, the propaganda prize, the great city, the objective that the politicians had used to justify sending Townshend beyond his sustainable supply lines more than a year earlier. It had cost a catastrophic detour through Ctesiphon and Kut, and tens of thousands of lives, but the city was in British hands. Then came the most calculated move of the entire campaign, an act of such deliberate audacity that it exposes the true purpose of the whole enterprise more completely than any other single event. The northernmost of Iraq's ancient provinces, Mosul, set directly above the oil fields that Churchill's geologists had identified as the ultimate prize of the entire campaign. Under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Mosul was in the French zone. Churchill's government was not prepared to accept that. British forces were quietly repositioned throughout. October 1918, the armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed on the 30th of October. The war was officially over. British forces received new orders to advance. They occupied the city of Mosul on the 14th of November, 1918, 2 full weeks after the armistice had been signed, specifically to create a military fait accompli. In the oil zone before any peace conference could draw the legal lines that would give Mosul to France. It was a land grab conducted after the war had ended, by soldiers who knew the war had ended, on behalf of a government that understood precisely what it was doing. Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, had told assembled prime ministers of the British dominions in August 1918 exactly what the objective was. He said, with elegant directness, "I do not care under what system we keep the oil. But I am quite clear it is all important for us that this oil should be available. Not democracy. Not the liberation of oppressed peoples. Not the stability of the region. The oil, available to Britain. By any system necessary." The war ended. The language changed entirely. Now it was about responsibility, about civilization, about Britain's duty to guide the peoples of Mesopotamia toward eventual self-governance. The League of Nations formalized this arrangement in 1920, granting Britain a mandate over what was now officially called Iraq. The mandate was a legal vehicle built to resemble trusteeship while functioning as ownership. Britain would administer Iraq, set its laws, train its army, manage its finances, and, most critically, award its oil concessions. The Iraqi people were not asked whether they wanted to be managed by the power that had invaded their country twice in 6 years. They answered the question themselves. In the summer of 1920, a national uprising erupted simultaneously across the country. Tribal leaders, Shia clerics, Sunni notables, former Ottoman officers, and ordinary people who had watched the British arrive proclaiming liberation and then remain, governing, taxing, drawing lines across the landscape, and explaining to the population that they were not yet sufficiently advanced to govern themselves. The British suppressed the revolt with overwhelming force, including the systematic use of Royal Air Force bombers against villages and tribal gatherings, a tactic personally endorsed by Winston Churchill, who was by then colonial secretary. He wrote in a private memorandum that the use of air power against Iraqi tribespeople was a cost-effective means of maintaining order. The revolt was crushed. The oil remained British. In 1921, Churchill presided over the Cairo Conference and installed a new king over Iraq. Faisal, a Hashemite prince from the Arabian Peninsula who had led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans during the war. He was chosen because he owed his throne entirely to British sponsorship, because he had no indigenous power base in Iraq, and because he would govern in ways that would not threaten the oil concessions. The borders of Iraq were drawn not to reflect the ethnic, religious, or cultural realities of the peoples living within them. They were drawn to keep the oil-bearing province of Mosul inside the country Britain controlled. The Kurds of the north, the Sunni Arabs of the center, and the Shia Arabs of the south were enclosed together inside a single administrative container that served British strategic and commercial requirements rather than the logic of any actual community or shared identity. Then the desert finally confirmed what Churchill had staked everything on. On the 14th of October, 1927, the Turkish Petroleum Company, by now reorganized and controlled through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, struck oil at Kirkuk, in northern Iraq. A gusher erupted from the ground 40 feet into the air and burned uncontrollably for days before it could be capped. The oil that Churchill had gambled an entire military campaign on, that had cost 13,000 men at Kut alone and 30,000 casualties in the failed relief attempts, that had swallowed 4 years of blood and money across the entire Mesopotamian theater, was real. It was there. It was enormous. And through the interlocking machinery of mandate and monarchy and corporate concession, it belonged to Britain. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935. In 1951, the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized his country's oil, returning its revenues to the Iranian people. The British government's response was to help the CIA engineer a coup that removed him from power in 1953. In 1954, the company was renamed once more the British Petroleum Company, BP, the corporation that began as Winston Churchill's solution to a fuel crisis in 1912, is today one of the largest companies in the world, its name familiar to every driver at every petrol station on Earth. The lines that Sykes and Picot drew in 1916 still exist. The modern borders of Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, and Lebanon are their direct descendants. The concept of the nation-state, as imposed on the Arab world by European powers, who had just finished dismembering the Ottoman Empire, was designed to serve the administrative and commercial interests of the powers doing the imposing. A country built around a resource rather than a people. A state designed to be administered by outsiders rather than governed by its own citizens. A history of Iraq across the 20th century, the coups, the dictatorships, the wars, the decades of sectarian violence between communities that were never given a choice about sharing a country, the revolts that were crushed from the air, the kings installed by foreign governments and removed by their own armies, is inseparable from the conditions created by the British Mandate. None of it was an accident. All of it was a consequence. Iraq became a republic in 1958 when the monarchy Britain had installed was overthrown in a military coup. The new governments that followed were no more stable because the fundamental problem had not changed. A state with incompatible communities, artificial borders, and an economy dependent on a single resource, over which foreign powers retained enormous influence, is not a recipe for stability. It is a recipe for exactly what happened. Successive regimes attempted to solve through force what British cartographers had created through indifference. The oil flowed, the profits were contested. The violence continued. In 2003, a coalition led by the United States and Great Britain invaded Iraq for the second time in less than 15 years. The official justifications were weapons of mass destruction, the liberation of an oppressed people, the establishment of democracy in the Arab world. Before the invasion, the two largest British oil companies with interests in Iraq, BP and Shell, privately communicated to the British government that they wanted what they called a level playing field in the awarding of oil contracts after the removal of Saddam Hussein.
Their concern, stated with boardroom precision, was that a US-led war might produce a US-dominated carve-up of the Iraqi oil prize. Iraq's reserves, at least 10% of all known oil on Earth, second only to Saudi Arabia, remained the greatest untapped petroleum deposit in the world. BP and Shell wanted their share. The language of 2003 was different from the language of 1914. The calculation was identical. Churchill's decision in 1912 set in motion a chain of cause and effect that ran through the entire 20th century without a single break. The switch from coal to oil made the empire dependent on a resource it did not control. That dependency drove the purchase of epoxy. The purchase of epoch and the necessity of securing its supply drove the invasion of Mesopotamia. The invasion demanded escalation. Escalation produced Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon produced Kut. Kut was answered with a doubling down of extraordinary ruthlessness. The doubling down produced the capture of Baghdad and the post-armistice seizure of Mosul. The conquest produced the Mandate. The Mandate produced the borders of Iraq. The borders of Iraq produced a century of instability. And the instability kept Iraq's oil perpetually relevant to every major power that looked at the Middle East and saw, beneath its ancient sands and ancient peoples, not a civilization, but a resource. There is a version of this history in which Churchill's role is framed as the inevitable behavior of a great power acting in its own interests, as all great powers do, as they always have. In that telling, the British Empire was simply doing what empires do, seizing resources, drawing borders, installing friendly governments, suppressing revolts, the machinery of power acting according to the logic of power. There is truth in that framing, but it obscures something important. The specific decisions to invade in 1914 under a false pretext, to push beyond sustainable lines toward Baghdad, despite the warnings of field commanders, to negotiate in secret and divide the Middle East without consulting a single Arab, voiced to seize Mosul after the armistice, to bomb civilians from the air, to maintain a mandate that nobody in Iraq had requested. These were not inevitable. They were choices made by specific men at specific moments, and the consequences of those choices did not fall on the men who made them. They fell, and continue to fall, on the people who happened to be living on top of the oil, the people who lived on that land for 10,000 years, who built the first cities and wrote the first written laws and irrigated the first agricultural fields, while Northern Europe was still covered in unbroken forest, paid for Churchill's fuel problem. Across the entire 20th century, they are paying for it still. Every battle fought on Iraqi soil since November 1914. every border carved by a foreign hand, every dictator installed and toppled, every bomb that falls on a city that was old when Rome was young, every barrel of oil that rises from the Kirkuk fields to the surface and flows into the pipelines that cross the flat desert toward the tankers waiting in the Gulf. Every one of these things traces a direct and unbroken line back to one morning. A grey morning. A cold November morning in 1914, when the guns opened up before dawn, when soldiers waded through cold black mud at the edge of the Ottoman world, when the most powerful empire in history aimed its warships at a crumbling fort and told the world it was there to protect a pipeline. It was never about the pipeline, it was always about what was underneath the ground. And if you want to understand the modern Middle East, well, if you want to understand why this region has been at war in various configurations for more than a century, you must first understand one foundational truth. It was not a clash of civilizations. It was not the inevitable product of ancient religious division. It was not a tragedy of misunderstanding between cultures that could not communicate. It was a heist planned in a boardroom, executed with warships, soldiers, and secret deals signed in private rooms in London and Paris, built on calculations so cold and so systematic that the men who made them spent decades refusing to account for what they had set in motion. The sun set on the British Empire long ago. The shadow it cast over Mesopotamia in 1914 has never left.